helped me on a podcast that I was doing on flatbreads, and that's actually one of probably your first book. Actually, is this Flatbreads and Flavors your?
Yes, first book, and which I wrote with my now ex-partner, and which came out in 1995. So that's, for some of you, it's before you were born, but it still feels recent to me.
And just out of curiosity, I looked up salt in the index, and the one entry for salt is a salt bread from Rajasthan, batti roti.
Yes, yeah, well,
Yeah.
Really, many things come back to the subcontinent. Many things.
And you come back to the sub because
yes.
You started coming to India even when you were studying law,
yes, and before, yes. So I guess my first journey to the subcontinent was a trip to Nepal for 10 weeks, and I transited through Delhi, and that was my first glimpse. And Delhi Airport in 1974 or 5 was, quite different from Delhi Airport now. It's really extraordinary. And when you as a foreigner, an ignorant foreigner, when you come to a place, and any place, over time, you start to understand how little you understood at the beginning, and how little you still do. But because as things change over time, you begin to perhaps see what was going on before that you hadn't seen. So the changes inform you about previous times. I know I'm sounding a bit obscure, but I think it's really important, this business of returning, always assuming you know nothing, because in fact, really, as an outsider,
so the more
one always knows relatively nothing.
The more you know, how little you know.
No, absolutely.
Yes.
But over time, the changes over time really inform you enormously.
Would you remember when you first came to Goa?
Oh, I first came to Goa in 2000. No, something like 2000. Yeah,
wow.
yeah. So, and I had stayed away before because I thought, that's that place that people go to hang out on the beach, and I didn't understand about Goan culture.
Right.
I just thought of Goa as a destination for other people, and what I'm interested in is home cooking and home life and agriculture and so on. And so when I did come here with my ex and my 2 kids, and we hung around actually in Palolem mostly, and came into Panjim a bit, but also we were working on the rice book. No, it was before then. It must have been 96. And so we found, and rice agriculture is so important here. It was a beginning of opening my eyes. But really, again, Goa is so full of layers of culture that even a neo-Goan is probably
absolutely.
still learning.
I'm exactly in the same position as yours. That the longer I live in Goa, the more I understand how little I know it, and how much more there is to know. And actually, salt is a good example because until very recently, I had no particular idea about salt. But then I have to say, Reina Sequeira's book. This book is really illuminating because once you read it, you realize that there's no one such thing as Goan salt. There are many Goan salts. That the salt from Pernem is different from the salt from Arpora, which is different from the salt from Salset, and each type of salt is different. And and it's not easy getting these salts because traditional salt making, as you document in your book, is now an endangered profession.
Well, the one thing that's the same is that salt requires incredible labor. It just requires incredible labor, and it requires calories. It requires calories from the sun, maybe, which would be the way people would get salt here, to evaporate. But it requires labor beforehand to set things up so that, like, build the salt pans, as you described, and as Vivek talked about. But in other places where there isn't sunshine, certainly not reliable sunshine, people have to be inventive in other ways. And so it requires calories like burning wood and then creating pollution and deforestation as a result. Salt is a very costly thing for which now these days we pay very little. And so one of the things I wanted to write about in the book was to remind people that of the what it represents in terms of human endeavor, because it's the only food we have to have. That's why people could be held hostage by the British, by many governments everywhere, why there are wars fought, because control of salt is control of survival, of a necessity, right? And everything else, I mean, yes, we need liquids like water, but in terms of food, salt is really the only one we have to have. Think of that. It's a form of, human servitude to this necessity.
Okay, since we're talking about salt, and since it's a large audience, I'm actually going to ask one of the volunteers to start passing this around. Please take a little, taste it. This is solar salt, basically evaporated from the sun. This is from Pernem, and as you'll see, it's extremely distinctive.
It's beautiful too. Yeah. It's really beautiful.
And I was again trying to look at where salt fitted into your previous books, because one set of your books is about place. It's about this book, Mangoes and Curry Leaves, is about your interactions with India. You've written a book.
Well, the whole subcontinent.
The whole subcontinent. And you've written about China beyond the wall, and you've written about Burma, and you've written about the Persias, all the different places that come under the label of Persias. And then you've also written books about rice and flatbreads.
Yep.
And to me, it seems to me that what's really interesting about salt is that salt is actually an expression for place. It actually comes from place.
Yes, but
like this is Pernem. What you're tasting is Pernem.
You're lucky. You're in Goa. I mean, and in Goa, however many hundred years ago, there was salt, or there was access to salt. There are people living in places where there is no salt.
Right. And like Nepal, for instance. You talk about
for example,
Nepal.
like Nepal.
Yes.
And so, well, how do you get it then? Well, you have to trade for it. Well, the person that has it can ask quite a lot for it. It's an expensive thing, because you have no choice. You have to buy it. You have to find it somewhere. And so it's that thing that's also distinctive, that salt is not evenly distributed around the world. We have air, good or bad. We have air everywhere, but we don't have salt everywhere. And that's the thing now, public transit, modern transportation, we can ignore perhaps those things. But in earlier times, until recently, really, so Goans have always been rich in having salt. You have salt, you have water, you have seashore and fish, you have fertile land. I mean, this is a paradise in pre-industrial times, which of course is why it's prospered for millennia.
Yeah, and again, it's part of Goan food. I mean, like and I will hope that we have Fatima Silva Gracias in the audience, who's the great chronicler of Goan food, and I'll ask her maybe to talk a little bit about salt, when we come to the question and answers. But again, salt is salted fish. Yes. Is vital for seeing Goans through the long monsoon season, and in your book you talk about all the histories of salt cod, and Goa is the one place where salt cod is actually something which comes through the Portuguese influence.
Through the Portuguese, yes, because if you think about, so we have to have salt to survive, but also everywhere where there's seasonal food, and that's most places in the world, salt is the assistant to preservation.
Right.
So, you salt fish, even if you have lots of sun, you still need to put a bit of salt on that fish.
Right.
To hold it, to keep the bacteria at bay until the fish has dried out enough that there's no moisture for the bacteria to survive with. And in places where it's not sunny, then the fish has to be heavily salted, which is the situation for cod in the North Atlantic, where there's really no sunshine, excuse me, but really there isn't. I'm from Canada, I can tell you there's not much sun in the North Atlantic. So then that fish is really heavily salted, and that's why salt cod is like a board, because it's completely saturated with salt, absolutely saturated, and then you have to do all the work of soaking it and cleaning it, right?
And salt gods' histories are fascinating, right?
It's a whole other thing.
I mean, Mark Lansky wrote a whole book about.
And we could talk all day, you know.
Yeah. And it links to slavery. It links to like indentured labor. It links to like global trade, and it links to Goa because, as I said, you know, in Goa, salt god came to us through the Portuguese. But as I said, you know, there are so many other fascinating histories of salt, and as you talked about, you know, taxation and used by governments. Controlling salt is a way of controlling power.
Absolutely, and also if everybody has to buy it, that's a handy little thing. Let's just put a little tax on this thing that absolutely everybody has to have, and then the treasury fills. But if you think about the difference between the rich and the poor, that tax is heavy on the poor because they don't have much else, but they're still having to pay the same tax on salt. It's really interesting.
Reina Sequeira, in her book, she starts off by talking about all the difficulties she faced trying to get access to the salt-making communities, because whenever she went as a researcher, they would say, "Are you from the government?
Exactly.
Are you going to tax us? Do you want information from us?"
Yeah, no, it's really interesting.
Have you faced these sort of reactions?
No.
Saying, why are you so interested in salt?
But just generally going to places where the government might potentially be onerous, whether it's in Burma or Tibet or anywhere, I have learned not to take notes in public because people will think that might think that I'm taking notes for the government for some bad purpose.
Right.
So I mean, for years I've traveled and taken notes with my camera in the sense of taking shots, and then going back to wherever I'm staying and making notes to myself about what I saw or what I was told, because of course there's always, as the outsider to a community, to a region, to a country, you know, you're always potentially, you know, the informer or the person who's going to put people at risk. And so it's really important to just sort of be as quietly there as you can be. But I'm very visible in India, and I'm very visible in many places. And so just sitting still and not asking a lot, just sort of sitting and appreciating is the best way in a politically fraught context, whether it's politically fraught because they're the salt workers or a larger situation. That's the best way to actually come to slowly get some understanding of what is going on.
I mean, what is remarkable about your books, and I'm speaking a bit more generally about this, is that you know, you seem to have in all your books avoided that exoticizing gaze.
Yes.
You know,
I hope so. Thank you very much. That makes me happy that you feel that way.
I mean, you've managed to get into cultures, but not treat it. I mean, you're not an insider. You don't pretend to. You don't pretend to be an insider, and yet you're not like looking at it as a travel writer. You know, that sort of like thing. How do you manage that? I mean, is it conversations? Is it home cooking? Is it the sort of connections the people you try to meet?
I mean, of course, my primary goal is to avoid that. But also, you know, when you're a foreigner traveling wherever, you meet other foreigners. I've met other foreigners, and they'll say, "Ooh," one example that's sort of relatively recent for me is people talking about food in Burma, Central Burmese food, Burma food, and a foreigner saying, "Oh, you know, it's so oily." It enrages me, any comment by an outsider about a local food, because they're ignorant, of course. So and I actually now take the advantage of my age and say, but that's your ignorance. I mean, that's an aggressive thing to say to somebody you don't know, but I do. That's your ignorance. Actually, it's not oily. Burmese have lunch meals, and it's not vegetarianism particularly. There's meat, there's veg, but the meals are prepared at noon like meals in the South, and it's hot climate, and so the curries are cooked, and of course they're cooked, and the oil sits on the top surface, and when the curry is served, you know, there's the curry, there's the rice, there's the whatever. Of course, it's not the oil, the curry is served. Well, what's the oil doing there? of course, as you all know in a hot climate, it's preserving the food underneath. Right. It's sealing it off from the air. But, many ignoramuses from, North America, Europe, whatever, will look at that and say, ooh, the food's so oily, and I just want to tell them to catch a plane home. Just leave. Just get the hell out. If you find something strange in a place in which you're not, local, then you have to ask yourself, what am I not understanding? So that's where I go. You have to sort of say, what don't I get here? Why do people find this delicious, and why am I having trouble with it? What's going on? And that's the start point. And so it's always about trying to just quiet down, have no expectations, and sort of try and understand and not rush. And that's, I think, the really
not rush.
And not rush.
Not rush.
It's just really important. It's not the job of any particular place or any particular cook or any particular market to kind of yield up its secrets or its, this is just nonsense garbage, that attitude. It's instead my job to appreciate and try to appreciate better by understanding better. And so I just think I'm always a beginner, and people say, oh, what's the best meal you ever ate, or what's the best thing you ever ate? And I was like, stop. It's not about, oh, what's good and what's bad and what's sophisticated and what's not. And, this is a food. We're talking about essentials. How interesting. Human creativity, and the most amazing thing is somebody making a perfect, roti, perfect chapati. You watch someone who's made gazillions of them. I was staying in a household, vegetarian Hindu household in Varanasi once, and I just watched these perfect chapatis come one by one, the woman of the house making them, and I just thought, okay, this is never going to be me. I know that. I'm not trying to be perfect, but she's just doing it.
Yeah.
Well, this is a miracle, and it's extremely sophisticated. There's 3 ingredients, right? And that's the thing that's really remarkable.
There's flour, there's water, and there's salt.
Yeah. It's not about how many, pieces of gold you put in your, wedding rice. Sorry if I've offended anyone, but it's about that lovely, extraordinary daily achievement of feeding people, using what you have to feed people well,
I mean, this is actually where I first connected with Naomi many years back for a podcast I was doing. And I was trying to answer this question about why have we found it so hard to mechanize roti, chapati production, flatbread production in India. I mean, in Mexico, for instance, now, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, tortillas have been industrialized. Their production tortillas has been industrialized. But many people have tried. You've had roti makers, you'd have these machines, you've had that, things like that. And we have never managed to make the large-scale production of rotis really acceptable. It happens in places like the Golden Temple and a few institutional contexts, but it's not. And so I actually finally called Naomi up because I'd read this book, and this is the most amazing book on flatbreads. And I asked, I think you were in Thailand at that time, and
that's right.
I said that, why is it impossible to mechanize this? And she said, you are competing with perfection.
Yes.
I mean,
these
not everybody's chapatis are perfect, but everybody's chapatis are perfect for, some people like it thoda kadak, some people like it slightly burnt, some people like it soft. There are millions of just 3 ingredients, and you can have so many millions of variations in making a roti, and that's what a factory can't produce. A factory can just standardize.
So this is human brilliance, right? This is just human achievement. And how wonderful, Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. You just simply said you are competing with perfection. Okay, I want to come back a bit to the authoritarian uses of salt, because there are so many fascinating histories over there. And one that you talk about, and which is a favorite of mine, is in this book. I mean, which Roy Moxon's The Great Hedge of India. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the story behind this?
This is back to the British and coerciveness, right? So how do you control people in a huge place, and how do you control people's access to salt, and how do you force them? It's sort of like forcing, farm animals in a pen. How do you control them? Well, you build barriers. And so, not wanting to give any suggestions to the current powers, but just saying, they're already talking like that. But anyway, so the British built this huge hedge across India, and I've never seen the site, and apparently it's hard to find. This guy said he'd read about this hedge, and it was to prevent the traffic of salt, and it's somewhere across the middle of India.
It's across like mostly through central India.
Through central
India. And it's a history that was completely forgotten.
Yeah.
And Roy Moxham, who's a very quirky historian of India, just found a few reference to it. And the Great Hedge of India, like the Great Wall of China, the Great Hedge of India.
And it was really tall and thick and impenetrable.
And it's made out of thorny plants.
Yeah.
And of course, being plants, they can be cut down. They were burnt. I mean, the hedge has pretty much vanished. I mean, he finds a few patches that may be descendants of the plants that made the hedge. But the thing is, it was about salt.
It was all about
this incredible venture, the head of India, which is also called the permit line. It was called the permit line because you needed a permit to take salt across. And I always remember this in summer, because among the plants that were used, they basically used thorny plants, thorny bushes. And one of them was karonda, kantem, what we call over here. So every summer when the kantem, the karonda berries come, and I always trying to get as many as I can to make jam out of it. I always remember the hedge of India because the hedge of India probably promoted planting kantem berries right across India.
I'd like to talk about we talked about salt fish, but in further in northern climates, there's a lot more in Korea, in Europe, and so on. There's a lot more winter where there really isn't anything growing, and so how do you have vegetables in winter? Well, you can put them in a root cellar in a cool place,
right.
But you can hang them and dry them. But you can also ferment them, and that's sauerkraut, kimchi, all of those things. And of course, you can ferment beans, which is, fermented beans, soybeans, and then that gets you to soy sauce. All of those things are salt-based. And how you make sauerkraut is you slice cabbage very thinly, you toss it with a measured amount of salt, and you stuff it into a jar. This is a really, really complicated recipe. And then you put the lid on. And then you wait, and the cabbage, you make sure that it's sealed, and you make sure that there's enough liquid covering it. So you might have to add a little brine, and then the salt draws liquid out of the cabbage. You've massaged it in a little bit, but no vinegar, just that. And after a week, it's fermented. After 3 weeks, it really has flavor. But it keeps and keeps and keeps and keeps and never rots. And so if you think about somebody in Northern Europe with the snow to here and the ground hard, and forget it for, harvesting anything, just imagine those stalks. Or in Korea, which gets very cold and snowy. And they have these lovely jars, what's the word I'm looking for? Clay pots of kimchi. And there it is, vitamin C, flavor, a little crunch, even with the salt softening it, all winter. It's a literal lifesaver.
And you say in your book quite early on that a history of a salt is also a history of fermentation.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because controlling fermentation salt is used to dictate the pace of fermentation, when it starts, when it stops. And I think that's something we understand in Goa very well, because one of the most basic Goan pickles is the green mango in salt brine, which is again one of the most basic Goan pickles, which I'm very happy to see is now the sort of hipsters have taken it up, and you can get martinis made with Goan brine mango pickle and things like that. But that is a very basic pickle.
And I saw those little green mangoes
coming out just now, so soon.
In the market. They're already in the veg market.
Soon we're going to be starting to make
very
pickle.
exciting.
And your book has a mango pickle, right?
Yes, the book has a mango pickle, and it's from a little further north. I'm sorry, everyone, but it's and it's got a bit of mustard oil in it that gives it away. But it's I find it really delicious. But you could, there's mango pickle all over India, but very different versions of it. But it's not a sweet one, it's a savory one, just like yours.
You're right.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the people who make salt? Because, Rena's book, for instance, talks about the traditional Goan salt communities, and she talks about the difficulties she has in winning their trust and how she becomes part of them and becomes part of their rituals and things like that. And, as you traveled across the world, did you find commonalities with all the different people who make salt across the world?
I don't know enough about them. I really don't. I think that specialized communities like that, you really, her difficulty, and she's going in penetrating it. So I can say I don't know about those communities. I really don't. I just know that from the outside, from a step back from there, in other words, the people who are profiting from the labor of those communities are not those communities.
Right.
All right? So whoever's laboring and walking in thick, salty brine in Kutch, for example, laboring.
And it's physically painful.
It's also, the sun is beating. It's blinding. It's hot. When you have a heavy salt, it's like, we talk about rubbing salt in the wound. So if you have a scratch on your foot or anything, okay, it's not going to get infected if you're walking in salt water, but it's going to hurt too. So they're working in these very ungenerous, horrible conditions, and they're being paid, pennies, paisa, right? And similarly, and in Korea, I've read there's salt workers who there's mentally handicapped adults being exploited to work in salt because it's really coarse labor is what it's viewed as. And the people profiting are the middle people, the distributors, the overseas shippers, and so that's the other thing about salt is it's, labor is a political issue. And so that's another reason to sort of pay attention to it. But I don't know about the social condition, the social culture of salt makers in other places.
Okay, sure. Okay. What do you feel about the rise of iodized salt? This is a controversial subject, I'm struck by the. I know you don't take a position on this in the book, and you talk about the benefits for people with goiter and all that. But you also talk about how the rise of government campaigns promoting iodized salt has made people across the world, especially in Thailand, I use the example, to think that traditional non-iodized salt is somehow dirty.
Well, okay, if you're trying to persuade people to shift or to adopt something new, you're the government, and there's a very good reason for iodizing salt. We can go into that, but what you do first of all is you tell them that the thing they're doing now is, you can pick your word, unclean, or less healthy, or whatever slogan is going to get you to shift off that and into the new thing that the government's promoting. So that's what's happened in places where people are being persuaded to shift. But then in many places, people aren't particularly given the choice. There is just iodized salt. And the reason for it is that iodine, in many places, iodine is not available in the food that people are eating. It's not true here. You're living by the seaside and there is plenty of iodine in the diet. But people, especially in the hills, we know this in the hills and mountains, where do you see older pictures of people with goiters? They're often in Tibet, in the valleys in Switzerland, for example, people had goiters into the 20th century.
Even in central India.
You would have it in central India too. And so to protect against that, because it's not just about goiters, it's about brain development, mental retardation, all of those things are risks when you have an iodine shortage. And so it started in the 1930s because there was an area of Michigan in the USA where everybody noticed, there's an iodine problem and there's a developmental problem amongst some of the children, especially lower income where they weren't eating widely, etc. And so it's become a World Health Organization campaign, and I saw iodized salt. I saw salt being gathered in an old-style way in Senegal in West Africa in the 90s, and then it was going to go off in a truck and be iodized. So, it really salt at every level is being iodized. Sea salt doesn't need to be. It's salt from the interior that doesn't, and anyway, it's it's more complicated. I don't want to generalize. But so I think, yes, use iodized salt to perhaps salt your water if you're pre-boiling rice, or if you're making pasta or noodles or something. But when I'm adding salt at the end of cooking, when I'm thinking, oh no, it needs a little more, that you taste the dal at the end, or the soup, or the whatever, then I'm going to use a salt that I like the smell of, because I'm picking it up in my hand, and the smell of good salt is a different thing from the smell of iodized salt, which for me smells yucky. So, sorry. And so I don't generally, I use iodized salt occasionally, but really I don't usually.
But I suppose it's difficult
because...
But
it's not bad for you. There's nothing wrong with it.
Because industrial salt is this perfect, shining, white, like free-flowing thing. Whereas, I hope everybody's had a chance to taste the Perm salt that I was sending around, and it looks like sand. It looks like sand. It looks like sand. But it has a very elusive taste. I don't know if other people felt this.
Too. When you pick it up, you can smell it. It's the differences are small. They don't. Once it's diluted in water, you cannot tell. Which, whether you're using salt from, Timbuktu or salt from down the road. But did you do that, Vivek? But it's really, I know we only have about 4 minutes left, but it's really use the salt that you're comfortable with. And if you decide to change the salt you're using for cooking, be careful, because the saltiness of an amount of salt, if you think of a tablespoon of salt, if it's flake salt, flat flakes, the amount of saltiness a tablespoon gives is measured not by the volume, but by the weight. So if you have a scale that does this, if you weigh an amount of salt and you compare that to fine-grained salt, the fine-grained salt, the same volume of salt, will be much heavier. It's saltier. So if you shift from a flake salt to a fine-grained salt, and you add your same pinch, it'll be oversalted. I'm just saying, it's a fun sort of thing, and the cooks in the room are nodding because they understand what I'm saying.
You know what it means. Okay, I've just got 2 more questions, and we'll throw it open to the audience. One is...
no, we only have 5 minutes altogether. We're done.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So, one is how in all your travels around the world, how have you seen salt being stored? Because in India there are traditional vessels, usually of wood, particularly types of wood like red sanders, which were used for storing salt. Have you seen a similarity, or what sort of vessels were used to store salt?
Mostly wood. Wooden containers. Yeah. And because of course metal, it corrodes metal. So that's why I never understood why the British had salt cellars, because of course if you have a silver salt cellar on a fancy table, it's going to get corroded on the inside. Does anybody have any questions though, because we're really running out of time?
Yeah. Alan, you want to start? Yeah.
One up front.
Okay, sorry.
Hi, thank you. That was amazing. I just had a question going back a little bit towards the beginning about how cheap salt is, and how did it go from this tool of power and control to just another commodity that looks the same everywhere? And is it cheap everywhere, or are there still parts of the world where it's expensive?
Is salt cheap everywhere, and how did it transfer? Well, it became, now there's a lot of industrial salt production. So it's all industrialized. What they do is, when it's in the ground, they dig it out using water. They actually dilute it and then re-boil it to crystallize it again. And all of that they can do very cheaply. And so there is labor in that industrial salt. And so the flow of salt, to put it that way, is not controllable, and nobody's using it for taxation anymore. We're living in a different world, I think, and it's got to do, I think, with the globalization of the food supply and the industrialization of the food supply. But you had a question in the front?
Question. Yeah. What is the timeline of the Great Hedge? Which year was it?
18 something or other.
I asked the main question.
Yeah, mid-19th century, the Great Hedge. Yeah.
And my main question is, do you see a difference between the coastal salts and the desert salts of the Thar? Can you notice that?
Oh, I think is there a difference between the coastal salts and the desert salts? And Well, I think, you can always notice a difference when you set things side by side. And there's, desert salts in southern Morocco and so on. I have not tasted the salt from the tar. No. I've tasted the salt in Kutch, the salt that's done in the salt pans, the evaporated salts. But I have not tasted the salt in the tar.
I'll give you my...
Okay.
Take 2 questions. To wait till they both ask.
Okay, 2 questions together.
Well, we are now told that Himalayan or pink rock salt is very good for you. What is your opinion about that?
Okay, that's one. Second question.
No, I was looking at the medicinal value, the good and the harm in salt. One is that iodization is extremely important. Like you said, it prevents mental retardation. In many parts of India, you make sure you get that salt. And that when you salt from the sea, the additional benefit is that besides that, you get other minerals. So there is a benefit of the salt that you get locally. In Goa, you might get manganese and all those micronutrients would add value. And the third most important is salt and hypertension. So all the pickles and the dry things, that's just a warning.
Yeah. So the question was, is pink salt, the so-called Himalayan salt, they've done the most brilliant job of promoting it. It's from the Kura mine in Pakistan, and it's the second largest salt mine in the world. So the notion that it's somehow a rare and special thing, no, I don't. I'm not buying that one. A friend of mine who's from Pakistan said, "Oh, my father knows a guy who's on the board of directors or whatever of the mine, and if you want to go, you could go down in that mine." And I said, 2 miles underground is not my kind of home territory. I don't think I'm going. I'm prepared to go many places, but not there. So I don't know. I'm just suddenly no. Oh, time out. Okay, so I'm answering it.
No.
So
Okay, I'm just going to say, I just want to say one small thing.
Let her answer the question.
but
Yes, sir,
it's really the differences, the amount of salt we're eating each day, and the differences between salts are not going to make a measurable difference to your life. If you eat well, if you're lucky enough to live in Goa and have access to fresh vegetables and fish from the sea, frankly, whatever salt you eat or don't eat, you're laughing, and compared to much of the rest of the world, you're way ahead. And that sounds superficial, but it's from the heart. I really mean it. Thank you for your notes on all of those things. Salt and hypertension, really, I think the main thing is if you're not eating processed foods and you're just salting your food in a normal way, you're fine, unless you've got kidney disease. Otherwise, not to worry about your salt.
I just wanted to make a small thanks to my friend Erwin Fonseca, who actually went yesterday to Pernem, to Agarwado to get this salt, and it's just an example of how difficult it is in Goa for Goans to get Goan salt. But if anybody wants to take some of the salt, please feel free. And Naomi, thank you so much. That was an absolutely wonderful session. And as I said, I really think this book is wonderful because, in a way, it sort of brings you back to all your previous books.
Yes.
Because your books are about food and place, and salt is really an expression of place. And I'm going to ask you one last question, just even though Vivek is fuming behind me. After all these years, you started from Canada, you've gone across the world, you've seen this thing. How has food in Canada changed now? Has all the huge immigration that we're seeing into Canada, is it changing Canadian food?
Oh, I'm lucky enough to live in Toronto, where there are people from kind of all over the world, and yes, I mean, there's an awareness. There's the globalization of food, so things are available. So people coming as immigrants can most often find or figure out how to get food staples that they need from their home place, and so those of us who live in urban areas are lucky because we get to live in a large world and get reminded of, again, all that we don't know about other people's food. So, but it's also a way of of having mutual understanding across cultures when a lot of people are arriving as immigrants. Because the kids are at school together, and they bring school lunch, and the one kid is bringing tofu and whatever, and the other kid's bringing a little dal bhat, and then the other kid's bringing a peanut butter sandwich, and they trade foods, So it's sort of, and then they go to each other's houses. And the parents are maybe dismayed, but the kids are at ease. And so that's what we need to think also, that the change comes as the generations unfold and start talking to each other. And that sounds very, optimistic, but I've seen it in my lifetime.
And it's a conversation you've helped start with your book, so thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. The fabulous Naomi Duguid, guys, you can find her book online. You can buy them. Thank you so much for that session. And Vikram Doctor, wonderful, wonderful. If anyone wants salt of the earth, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Please keep your seats.